Hi there, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Gardener, and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. It's July 12th. Today we celebrate the man who inspired National Simplicity Day. It's dedicated every July 12th. We also learn about the tragic death of a Scottish botanist and prolific plant collector. And we celebrate the friendship between Charles Darwin and his mentor. And we also celebrate a woman who started botanizing late in life, yet made a significant impact on the world of horticulture. In Unearthed Words, we celebrate the fern. By this time in July, you're either loving them or digging them out of your garden. And we grow that garden library with a grilling guide for gardeners. And then we'll wrap things up with a sweet little story about the botanical name for San Francisco. But first, let's catch up on some greetings from gardeners from around the world in today's curated news. Well, first off, let me just begin by saying for the very first time, I'm recording outside. I'm out on my deck at the cabin. I'm surrounded by my kitchen garden. I can see the lake. I can see my garden shed. And you get to hear some of nature's soundtrack from up here at the lake. And we'll have to see if we can hear any loons this morning. All right, for gardener greetings, we kick things off with Jody D., who wrote in to share a picture of her bee balm. And she writes, I put in one little pot of bee balm many years ago, and it's completely taken off. It loves this little sunny corner of the garden. Well, Jody, I'm a huge fan of bee balm myself, and I've never forgotten the very first time I planted it. I was sitting on the ground and I had all these pots of bee balm around me, and I was putting it in this native area, and I kept catching a whiff of this most amazing fragrance. It was sweet and wonderful, and I'd never smelled it before. And finally, I put the two and two together, that what I was smelling was the bee balm, and it is one of my favorite fragrances in the garden. I love bee balm. Bee balm is so beautiful. It's a very carefree plant. And the hummingbirds love it as well. So that's another bonus. It's just an all-around great plant. Then next up, Annie Morgan wrote in from Oregon, and she shared yesterday's harvest. She shared a picture of her zucchini and potatoes and red cabbage. And she's growing both a darker red potato as well as a yellow potato. And the dark red ones look fantastic. Great harvest there in Oregon. And then finally, Rhonda E. shared a picture of her strawberry plants. And the leaves have been turned into lacework. And of course, that's the work of the Japanese beetle. She writes, any idea how to keep these bugs away from my strawberry plants? Well, actually, I do have a good idea. And I got this idea after speaking with Barbara Pleasant, one of my all-time favorite gardeners, and she has such great advice. But what Barbara does is she covers her vulnerable plants, the plants that are going to be attacked by Japanese beetles, and she covers them with a wetting tool. You know, the stuff that bridal veils are made out of? And just the other day I was talking to my mom. She and my dad are growing beans for the first time. And suddenly they were noticing Japanese beetles on the beans as well. And of course, they love beans. So I quick hopped on Amazon and ordered them a bolt of wetting tool. Now, I'll share the one that I ordered in the show notes for today's episode. But essentially, you want to get the tool that's super wide because you need to fully cover your plant. And the best part about using wetting tool is it's cheap. I could get my folks 120 feet of tool for $12.35. And I really liked the width of this as well. It's 54 inches by 40 yards. So it's plenty to cover their raised bed. She can double up if she needs to, but I don't think she will. And the best part about it is their first experience growing beans won't be ruined by the Japanese beetles. So for just $12.35, we're saving that bean crop, and they're learning about this really great best practice from Barbara. And from an aesthetic standpoint, wedding tulle isn't bad to look at. So that's a plus as well. And if you happen to be out in the woods gathering some long sticks, you can make a little teepee with the sticks and then drape the wedding tulle around the teepee. That actually looks very, very attractive. So just another idea for you as you're thinking about ways to preserve your garden harvest, especially this time of year when the Japanese beetles are out in full force. Now, if you already have a Japanese beetle issue going on, the first thing you should do is get out there and spray that plant with sharp streams of water. Get as many of the beetles off just by using water as you can. And then you're going to probably have to pick the remaining beetles off by hand. But once you have that plant completely cleaned off, that's the time you're going to want to put your tulle over the top of the plant. So don't put tulle around a plant that you haven't cleaned off, because all you're doing is giving them the perfect little home to do their work in. And they will. They'll strip that plant down to nothing. So do the work, clean up your plant, and then apply the wedding tulle. And once again, the link for this particular bolt of tulle that I got on Amazon for $12.35 will be shared in the Facebook group for the show and in today's show notes. All right, that's it for today's Gardener Greetings. Now, if you'd like to participate in the Gardener Greetings segment, just send in your garden pics, stories, questions, your birthday wishes, and so forth to Jennifer at thedailygardener.org. That's Jennifer at thedailygardener.org. Make sure you're doing .org and not .com. And you can also post it in the Facebook group for the show. If you have something you want for Gardener Greetings, you can just post it in the group. If you want to make sure that I see it, you could just tag it Gardener Greetings, or, please post this in Gardener Greetings, and I will definitely follow up for you. And to listen to the show while you're at home, here's a reminder that all you need to do is ask Alexa or Google to play the latest episode of the Daily Gardener podcast, and they'll do that for you. It's just that easy. Here's today's curated news. Well, I'm so excited to share this post with you. It was featured in The Guardian, and it was written by Nigel Slater. And the title of the post definitely caught my eye. It says, "I feel as if my garden has finally come of age." And for any of you who have been gardening for a while, that is the best feeling in the world. And I thought Nigel did such a wonderful job of capturing why he felt that way and what that meant in terms of the evolution of his garden. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I will give you just a little excerpt of some of the highlights that I thought were particularly touching and relatable. Nigel writes, "Getting rid of the rectangle of mown grass that passed for a garden was the first thing I did when I moved into my new home on a bitterly cold New Year's Day 20 years ago." And he writes, "I learned very quickly that every disaster in the garden is an opportunity in disguise." And then he writes about how he uses the Chelsea chop in his garden. It's just a technique where you cut down some of your blooming perennials, like phlox or sedum, and you can delay the bloom time. And you can also make that plant a little sturdier because you're chopping it back and it's not going to get so leggy. So you'll hear Nigel refer to that Chelsea chop in this next excerpt. He writes, "Of late, the garden has settled into a gentle rhythm. Once a year on a dry spring day, shortly after the Chelsea Flower Show, everything gets a serious trim. The Chelsea chop, as it's known. Hedges are clipped, topiaries shaped, and overhanging branches of the fig and medlar tree are pruned. It's a tidy up that might appeal to the sort of gardener who power washes their flagstones and scrubs the moss from their pots. But to me, it feels as if a much-loved and elegantly aging friend has gone in for a round of cosmetic surgery. Not unrecognizable, but slightly cold and distant, and to my mind, a little dishonest. for a couple of weeks a year, the garden doesn't quite seem like mine. I loved that description of the Chelsea chop. It is really hard for gardeners to go in and do that, especially for the first time, because it feels so bizarre, like you're chopping off the head of these beautiful plants that you've been wanting to grow. It just seems counterintuitive. So I really like how Nigel talks about this. And I thought it was hilarious that he likens it to a round of cosmetic surgery. So now I will forever think of the Chelsea chop through Nigel's eyes. And then finally, I wanted to share an excerpt where Nigel talks about his perspective on his garden today. It's the last paragraph in his essay, and I found it particularly touching. He writes, "I would like to say that the garden I have now will probably be my last. 20 years on from digging up the lawn, I have a space that is more inspirational and restful than I could have ever imagined. I feel the garden has come of age. Yet the space still refuses to stand still. Even now, there are changes afoot. This year, I reintroduced the vegetables and sweet peas that I missed so much. Tomatoes and calendulas now grown in huge terracotta pots on the kitchen steps, and there is an entire table of culinary herbs. There are tubs of marigolds and stands of bronze fennel. Next year, there may be more. The garden will never be finished. I have no idea what will happen next. All I know is that there won't ever be a lawn." Love that post. Just today, my daughter and I were working on poetry for the August episodes, and one of the things I love to do is look up poetry regarding the birth flowers for the month. And Emma was born in July, so she was asking me what the birth flowers were for this month. And as I mentioned in last week's show, July has a lot of different birth flowers, everything from the rose to the delphinium to even the lotus. In fact, July is the month of the lotus in China. And it reminded me of a video that I shared last year in the Facebook group for the show, and I'm going to reshare it again today, so keep an eye out for it. But it's a video from the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, which shows the senior horticulturist there, Pat Clifford, teaching their intern Hazel how to remove the older leaves of the giant water lily so that the pond doesn't get overcrowded. And here's what happens. Using a pitchfork, Pat carefully folds this giant lily pad, first in half, then in quarters, and then once more. And by the way, they're both standing hip deep in this water. So they're all among these giant water lilies, and he's taking a huge pitchfork, and he's not a little guy. He's taking a pitchfork, and he is hoisting this water lily pad that looks to be about 5 or 6 feet across, and he's folding it up like the kids do when they're eating a big pizza sometimes. Then, after he's got it all folded up into quarters, Pat stabs this large folded pad with the pitchfork, hoists it into the air to let the water drain out, and it looks very heavy. He's straining to do this, and then he flops the beast down on the edge of the pond. And at this point is when the jaw-dropping moment happens in the video, because the camera zooms in and reveals the most savage thorns that grow on the underside of the lily pad and all down the stem of the plant. And it was so surprising to see how vicious those thorns are, rivaling even the thorniest rose. So check that out when you see it again. If you've seen it before, you'll still like to see it. And if you've never seen it, it really is a wow. But anyway, July, the month of the lotus in China. And then the last thing I have for you today is just the idea that you can propagate your pelargoniums through cutting. And if you've never taken cuttings of your pelargoniums before, you will be delighted with the results. Now, if you're listening going, Jennifer, I have no idea what pelargoniums are. That's fine. Pelargoniums are known commonly as cranesbills or hardy geraniums. But please don't think about these like your grandmother's red geraniums. That's not what we're talking about. These are hardy perennials that come back year after year. They have a delicate little flower. They're adorable. One of my favorites. So if you have them in your garden, like the Johnson's blue geranium, you'll know what I'm talking about. And if you don't have it, you can go get them and then just know that eventually you can propagate that plant through cutting. Now, how you go about this is that you just snip off short lengths of your favorite pelargonium, remove any leaves from the lower part of the stem because that stem is going to get pushed into your pot. Then, once you've got that stem cleaned off, you're going to dip the stem in some rooting powder and then place it in the pot. And then all you have to do is keep it nicely watered. And before you know it, you'll have a new baby pelargonium plant off to the races. Pelargoniums root so quickly, you'll have many new plants in just a few days. All right, that's it for today's gardening news. Now, if you'd like to check out my curated news articles and blog posts for yourself, you're in luck because I share all of it with the listener community in the free Facebook group, the Daily Gardener Community. So there's no need to take notes or search for links. The next time you're on Facebook, just search for the Daily Gardener Community and request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. Here's today's brevities. Today is the birthday of the American essayist and philosopher Henry David Thoreau. An advocate for living a simple life, National Simplicity Day is observed every July 12th in Thoreau's honor. It was Henry David Thoreau who said, "Though I do not believe that a plant will spring up where no seed has been, I have great faith in a seed. Convince me that you have a seed there, and I am prepared to expect wonders." And he also said, "Gardening is civil and social, but it wants the vigor and freedom of the forest and the outlaw." And it was on this day in 1834, about a month before his 35th birthday, that the Scottish plant explorer David Douglas and his little Scottish terrier named Billy arrived at the northern tip of Hawaii. After landing, David met up with a man named Ned Gurney. And I know it's hard to imagine, but Gurney actually made his living trapping feral cattle that were just wandering about on the island in large pits. As a young man, Gurney had been convicted of stealing, and he'd been shipped to Australia, but somehow he had made his way to Hawaii. And it was on this day in 1834 that his path crossed with David Douglas. That morning, Gurney told authorities that he had had breakfast with Douglas, that he'd given him directions, and that he'd sent him on his way. But tragically, by noon, David's body, along with an angry bull, was found in one of Gurney's pits. And sadly, Douglas's dog Billy, who traveled with him on almost all of his expeditions, was sitting there above the pit, all alone, by his master's pack. Today we know that how Douglas ended up in the pit is still a mystery. We will never know that. But we do know that David Douglas was responsible for the identification of over 200 new plant species in North America, including the famous Douglas fir. Despite his lack of formal training, Douglas sent back more plants to Europe than any other botanist of his time. And today there is a memorial to Douglas in Honolulu, which reads, "Here lies Master David Douglas, an indefatigable traveler. He was sent out by the Royal Horticultural Society of London and gave his life for science." And on the second bronze tablet, there's a quote by Virgil. "Even here, the tear of pity springs, and hearts are touched by human things." And it was on this day in 1835 that Charles Darwin wrote a letter to his friend, John Stevens Henslow. He wrote, "In a few days' time, the Beagle will sail for the Galapagos Islands. I look forward with joy and interest to this, both as being somewhat nearer to England and for the sake of having a good look at an active volcano." So if we would have asked Darwin what he was the most excited about, he would have said, seeing the active volcano. Throughout his life, Darwin exchanged many letters with Henslow, who was a professor of botany and mineralogy at Cambridge University. His correspondence was a powerful influence on Darwin, shaping his thinking about the natural world. When they were young men, Henslow and Darwin had walked the Cambridgeshire countryside together. Their walks inspired Darwin to study the natural world and to travel. And it was thanks to John Henslow that Darwin received the invitation to join Captain Robert Fitzroy on the HMS Beagle. Henslow had recommended Darwin for the journey because of his likable personality. And once Darwin was officially part of Team Beagle, Henslow gave him a gift, a copy of Humboldt's narrative, an account of Humboldt's travels in South America. And in it, Henslow had inscribed these words: J.S. Henslow to his friend C. Darwin on his departure from England upon a voyage around the world, September 21st, 1831. Well, needless to say, Darwin treasured this gift above all others, and at his death, the book was safely brought to Cambridge University Library, where it remains to this day. And someday I would love to see it. And finally, today is the anniversary of the death of the botanist Inez Mejia, who died on this day in 1938. In terms of her botanical career, Inez was a late bloomer. The first half of her life was turbulent, but at the age of 50, Inez joined the Sierra Club. Nature had always been a balm to her. Eager to get some formal training, Inez decided to enroll at Berkeley to take botany classes. She would take classes there on and off over the next 16 years. Inez's goal was never to graduate, but simply to learn more about plants. Yet when she wasn't in school, Inez fell in love with field work. She said, "I found a task where I could be useful and really produce something of lasting worth while living out among the flowers." Inez was especially drawn to unique plants, and she absolutely adored sunflowers. In fact, on one of her botanizing trips, she discovered an entirely new genus of compositae. And Inez's ability to speak Spanish came in handy as she botanized in the southwestern part of the United States, Mexico, and South America. Overall, Inez's collecting efforts proved extraordinary. Many scholars argue that Inez was the most accomplished plant collector of her time. Her first botanizing trip alone netted 500 specimens, the same number, by the way, that Darwin brought back on the Beagle. Over Inez's short career, she collected 150,000 specimens and discovered over 500 brand new plant species. Now, her botanist peers were well aware of her staggering amount of work, but not many liked her. Still, she did work closely with botanists Alice Eastwood, John Thomas Howell, and Agnes Chase. In 1938, Inez had returned to Mexico in search of new specimens, but the pain in her stomach got the best of her, and she was forced to return to the United States. And she died on this day from lung cancer at her beloved Berkeley. Inez's estate was donated in part to the Redwood Preserve in California, and there's a 40-acre grove there that has one of the tallest trees on the planet. And today, if you visit, that grove is named in her honor. Today, some 80 years after Inez's death, scientists are still processing the plants she collected. And there's an excellent PBS short film about Inez Mejia that was narrated by Juliana Margulies, and it just came out in the past year. And of course, I just shared it in the Facebook group for the show. So if you'd like to see it, I think it's well worth your time. Just head over to the Daily Gardener community, and you'll see that video. And search for Inez, Y-N-E-S. And this post will pop up. In Unearthed Words, today's poem is by the English writer and poet laureate Ted Hughes, and it's called Fern. Here's the fern's frond, unfurling a gesture, like a conductor whose music will now be pause, and the one note of silence to which the whole earth dances gravely, a dancer left over among crumbs and remains of God's drunken supper, dancing to start things up again, and they do start up to the one note of silence. The mouse's ear unfurls its trust, the spider takes up her bequest, and the retina reigns the creation with a bridle of water. How many went under? Everything up to this point went under. Now they start up again, dancing gravely like the plume of a warrior returning under the low hills into his own kingdom. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, The Gardener and the Grill by Karen Adler and Judith Fertig. This book came out in 2012, and the subtitle is The Bounty of the Garden Meets the Sizzle of the Grill. Dr. Mark Knobloch said, Dr. Mark Knobloch said, Americans have become so accustomed to firing up their backyard grills for all sorts of meats that they forget that vegetables flourishing in the nearby garden profit equally from the punch of flavor that barbecuing bestows. Grilling potato slices before tossing them with strongly herbed French vinaigrette adds a level of flavor often lacking in mayonnaise-dressed potato salads. Grilling green tomato slices before sandwiching them with cream cheese delivers a somewhat less heavy alternative to frying. For all their imaginative ways of grilling greens, Adler and Fertig by no means ignore fish and meat. Fish tacos brim with leafy greens and blackened fish pieces, and there's even a comforting burger. The authors advocate grilled slices of bread, and they present examples from Afghan, Indian, and Italian traditions. Searing fruits like peaches, apples, and figs underlies a number of sweet desserts. This book is 224 pages of recipes and tips, and it's all shared with today's gardener in mind. You can get a used copy of The Gardener and the Grill by Karen Adler and Judith Fertig and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $1. For $1, it's a steal, and it's a fantastic book. Love that one. And it's sitting on my kitchen cupboard right now. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. During this week in 1969, newspapers across the country were sharing this little snippet about San Francisco. They were using it as a space filler. And if they had a tiny little space they needed to fill, they were writing this. San Francisco was originally known as Yerba Buena, Spanish for good herb, a small mint-like plant early explorers found. Over the years, people have left their hearts in San Francisco, and the author Rudyard Kipling said, "San Francisco has only one drawback. 'Tis hard to leave." Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener, and remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Wyoming, Minnesota with the help of Paige Mance, Brooke Bierbaum, Kiana Rayleigh, Maddie Doyle, Natalie Decker, and Eric Begay. You can find The Daily Gardener on all your favorite social media. You can follow the show on Instagram, and listeners always have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. All the stories and books that are featured on the show can be found over at thedailygardener.org, thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. Last but not least, you can share your own gardener greetings on the show by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.